The second Ilhan Omar looked straight at President Donald Trump and said, on live television, "You don't belong in the White House." She stepped into the one trap that keeps swallowing politicians who think they're auditioning for a clip instead of walking into a fight. It's not that Trump is unbeatable in the moral sense, or even the policy sense. It's that he treats confrontation like a contact sport, and he refuses to play defense when offense will do. When he feels personally challenged, he doesn't reach for nuance. He reaches for leverage, and he's spent decades collecting it the way some people collect baseball cards. So if you're the type of politician who thinks a righteous line, a trending hashtag, and a friendly moderator are going to protect you, Trump is basically the worst possible opponent. And on that night, Omar didn't just poke the bear, she handed him the map to the campsite and asked him to give a speech. CNN billed the event like an act of civic hygiene, a town hall designed to pressure Trump on immigration and national identity. They framed Omar as the sharp counterweight, the kind of guest who could deliver the moral indictment with a clean face and a camera-ready voice. The plan, at least in the way these things are always planned, was for her to land a few lines that would ricochet around the internet for days while Trump squirmed under the lights. They stocked their backstage operation with fact-checkers, producers, and the sort of anxious energy you only see when a network believes it can manage chaos. The problem was that the network assumed the only chaos would be Trump's mouth, and not whatever he might walk in carrying. Trump showed up with a binder, thick and tabbed, the kind of prop that signals preparation even before anyone reads a single page. That alone should have changed the temperature in the room, because Trump doesn't bring paper to perform competence, he brings paper to perform certainty. Inside that binder, according to the way the night unfolded, were screenshots, timelines, old footage, and references to controversies that had been floating around for years, like smoke people argued about but rarely confronted head-on. To be clear, a binder isn't proof of anything by itself, and a stack of documents on television can be theater as much as evidence. But politics is partly theater, and Trump is the kind of performer who knows that if you control what the audience sees, you control what they feel first. The studio in New York had the staged neutrality of a modern confrontation show. Two chairs angled like dueling pistols and screens positioned like backup singers. CNN had a carefully mixed crowd, not too hostile, not too friendly, with just enough tension to make the broadcast feel real. Jake Tapper sat at the moderator's desk with the face of a man who'd been told to referee a heavyweight bout while wearing a suit made of paper. Backstage, Omar's team reportedly treated it like a high-risk media event, which is what it was, rehearsing responses and building fallback lines. Trump's camp, at least on camera, projected the opposite, the vibe of someone who believes the script belongs to him. Omar came out first, poised, polished, dressed like someone who understood that image is half the argument before the first word lands. Trump followed with the comfortable swagger of a man who's made a career out of acting like every room is his rooms. Tapper started his formalities about civility and structure, which always feels a little like announcing no splashing before someone cannonballs into the pool. Then Omar cut in fast, setting the tone the way viral politics teaches you to do. Strike first, frame the villain, claim the moral high ground. She went right for legitimacy, telling Trump he didn't belong in the White House, and you could almost hear the social media interns warming up their thumbs. Trump didn't flinch, and that's the first thing that should worry any opponent, because he's most dangerous when he looks amused. He answered with charm, complimenting her appearance, softening the room, turning the first punch into a handshake, which is a weird but effective reversal. Then he did what he always does when someone tries to make it about him as a person. He spun the spotlight so hard it nearly snapped off the ceiling. He signaled the control booth, and suddenly the screens were playing old footage, not of him, but of her. At that moment, the event stopped being Trump on immigration and became Omar on record, which is a very different kind of night. The first clip Trump leaned on was the "some people did something" line, the phrase that has followed Omar for years like a bad echo. In the most charitable reading, people argue it was a clumsy attempt to reference 9/11 in the context of civil liberties. And in the least charitable reading, it sounded dismissive in a way that insults the dead. Television doesn't reward charitable readings, and Trump knows that. So he let the clip breathe until the audience had already reached its own conclusion. He slowed down, repeated the phrase, and shifted into that lower, heavy voice he uses when he wants the room to feel moral outrage instead of partisan excitement. He talked about where he was on 9/11, about New York, about smoke and grief, and whether you like him or not. That's a story that lands because it's anchored in shared memory. Then he turned it into a question of gratitude and belonging, the kind of framing that makes people sit up even if they came in skeptical. He talked about America taking in refugees, about opportunity, about the idea that citizenship comes with obligations as well as rights. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't designed to be, because subtlety doesn't trend and doesn't stun. Omar tried to pivot toward accusations of prejudice, and Trump didn't let her set up that familiar defense. He moved to a different file tab, and this is where the night's tone took a sharp turn from emotional condemnation to controversy compilation. Trump brought up Omar's past comments about Israel and Jewish influence, especially the Benjamin's tweet and other lines critics have called conspiratorial. Here's the tricky part in a live spectacle. You can criticize a government without smearing a people, but in the heat of politics, those lines blur, and opponents weaponize the blur. Trump read the tweets with a prosecutor's cadence, then pointed out that Democrats themselves had condemned the language, which is an argument designed to say, "This isn't my bias, it's your own side." He waved references to House actions and public statements by Democratic leaders, and again, on TV, the visuals do half the work. Omar tried to reframe it as policy criticism, and Trump insisted it was about tropes, money, and insinuation, daring the audience to decide which reading felt more plausible. Tapper attempted to pull the conversation back to immigration, and Trump basically treated that as permission to open the next folder. He brought up the long-running allegations about Omar's marriage history, including the claims about Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi and the suggestion, often repeated online and denied by Omar, that the marriage involved a close relative. This is exactly where responsible commentary has to slow down, because allegations are not convictions, rumors are not rulings, and a sensational claim on TV can't be treated like a settled fact. But Trump didn't present it like a careful legal brief. He presented it like a story with a timeline, photos, and questions designed to put his opponent on the back foot. He leaned into the idea that if the allegations were false, she could prove it with documents, and he framed any refusal or inability to do so as suspicious rather than procedural. He also referenced Omar's past issues with campaign filings and state-level enforcement actions that have been reported publicly, including fines she paid in Minnesota related to campaign finance and tax filings. A fine isn't a felony, and paying a fine doesn't automatically mean something sinister beyond the violation itself. But in political theater, it gets treated like a confession written in ink. Trump read numbers out loud the way people read lottery winnings, because big numbers sound like corruption even when the underlying story is more mundane. He then expanded the argument into a moral claim about donor trust, suggesting that political money becomes personal money through consulting arrangements and insider contracts. And again, he didn't need to prove every implication in real time, because the goal of a televised takedown is to plant doubt, not to complete a trial. From there, he shifted to Tim Manet, Omar's current husband, and the campaign payments to a consulting firm associated with him. He laid out the timeline the way tabloid stories do, linking personal relationships to financial flows and daring the audience to connect the dots. To be careful, campaign committees paying consultants is not automatically scandalous, and relationships are not evidence of wrongdoing by themselves. But Trump framed it as a family business vibe, the idea that politics becomes a pipeline for enriching your inner circle, which is an accusation many voters already suspect about Washington. He mocked the rates as inflated, questioned the deliverables, and used the sheer size of the spending as the punchline. Because humor is a weapon when you want the audience laughing instead of listening for nuance. At this point, Omar's usual strategy, turning attacks into proof of prejudice, started to look less effective, because Trump was anchoring his critique in her own words and publicly known controversies. That doesn't make his interpretation automatically fair, but it makes it harder to dismiss with a single label. Trump understands that a victim narrative collapses when the audience believes it's being asked to ignore receipts, even if those receipts are selectively framed. So he kept piling, moving from 9/11 language to Israel comments, to marriage allegations to campaign spending, building a pattern rather than a single charge. In politics, a pattern is often more damaging than a specific allegation, because it tells the audience, this is who they are. Not, this is what they did once. Then came the terrorism air quotes footage that has circulated before. Another moment that sounds terrible even when people argue about context. Trump treated the gesture itself as the story, because gestures are easier to hate than paragraphs. He connected it back to 9/11 again, then broadened it into loyalty language. Whose side are you on? Do you condemn enemies without qualifiers? Can you speak about America without an asterisk? That's a loaded framing, and it's designed to make the opponent look defensive no matter what they say. If Omar condemns strongly, Trump's side says it's forced, and if she qualifies, Trump's side says she's justifying. And that's why it's such an effective trap. Omar tried to respond in broader foreign policy terms, and Trump kept dragging it back to symbolism and identity. He played clips of her criticizing American history and policy, then positioned those criticisms as contempt rather than debate. The truth is, plenty of Americans criticize American history and still love the country. But television isn't built for that distinction. Trump spoke like a salesman for patriotism, and he knows patriotism is an emotional product that sells especially well when people feel disrespected. He compared Somalia's conditions with America's metrics in a way that framed refuge as debt, which is rhetorically powerful even if it oversimplifies why people flee and how gratitude works. This is also where the knight in this story crossed into a line that always creates heat, the love it or leave it framing. That phrase hits like a hammer because it's simple, and simplicity is political gasoline. But it's also the kind of line that turns citizenship into a loyalty test, which is exactly why it's so polarizing. Trump delivered it like a closing argument, as if he were speaking for real America, and the audience reaction, at least as described, became part of the message. When a crowd cheers a line like that on live television, it doesn't just reflect an opinion, it signals permission for others to say it too. Even if you strip away the exaggerations and the hype, the underlying dynamic is recognizable. Trump wins these moments by making the other person defend 1,000 things at once. He doesn't argue a point, he argues a vibe. And the vibe is, you're not being straight with people. He doesn't need every accusation to be proven in that instant. He just needs the audience to feel like there are too many smoke alarms going off to ignore. And when someone like Omar tries to answer with a broad moral indictment, Trump treats it as proof that she can't answer specifics. That's how he reverses the usual script, turning the accuser into the accused, the prosecutor into the defendant. Tapper, in this kind of telling, becomes the tragic character who still thinks the segment can be saved by returning to policy. But policy requires patience, and what the room wanted by then was resolution, a winner, a loser, a clip that feels final. Omar's closing attempt, framed around prejudice and bigotry, sounded to many like repetition rather than rebuttal, because the night had already been defined by her record, not Trump's. Trump refused to let her exit on that note, because he understands that endings matter more than middles. He returned to legitimacy, to oaths, to patriotism, to belonging, and he delivered it with the theatrical certainty of a man who treats applause like evidence. Now, let's step back from the spectacle and ask the questions that matter if you're trying to tell this story without turning it into a smear job or a fan edit. Did Trump prove everything he implied? Or did he stack controversies in a way that made insinuation feel like fact? Did Omar genuinely mishandle language in ways that deserve criticism? Or did her opponents weaponize clips while ignoring fuller context? Are campaign payments to consultants inherently suspicious? Or do they become suspicious only when the relationship and the numbers make voters uneasy? And in a media environment that rewards outrage, is unease basically the same thing as guilt in the public mind? Because that's the real trick here. Modern political destruction isn't built on one decisive fact. It's built on a cascade of doubt. Most viewers don't go home and read original documents. They go home with a feeling, and that feeling becomes their conclusion. Trump is very good at manufacturing a conclusion-shaped feeling, especially when he can tie it to patriotism and disrespect. Omar, like many politicians who rose in the social media era, is very good at manufacturing moral clarity. And moral clarity works until the other person forces you into details. Details are where charisma goes to die, because details don't fit in a shareable clip. If you're scripting a voiceover from this, the tension you want isn't Trump exposed crimes, because you can't responsibly claim that without adjudication. The tension is Trump forced questions onto the main stage that Omar couldn't, wouldn't, or didn't answer cleanly in that moment, and viewers interpreted that as defeat. You can frame it as a clash of political styles. Omar as the moral prosecutor, Trump as the street corner cross-examiner who doesn't care if the courtroom rules are fair. You can frame it as a media failure, CNN thinking it could choreograph confrontation and discovering that Trump treats choreography like a suggestion. Or you can frame it as a warning about how a televised debate can turn complicated public controversies into a single brutal narrative that lives forever online. And yes, the online aftermath in stories like this always becomes its own plot line, because viral moments don't end when the cameras cut. Clips spread faster than corrections, and jokes spread faster than context, and outrage spreads faster than anything else. People start chanting slogans, not because slogans are accurate, but because they're satisfying. That's why responsible storytelling has to resist the urge to turn the crowd's worst impulses into your script's punchline. If you want this to feel like sharp American commentary instead of a mob scene, you keep the focus on the spectacle and the incentives, not on encouraging people to pile on. So what does this story really say underneath the exaggeration and the showmanship? It says that identity politics, whether you love it or hate it, is not an invincibility cloak when the opponent can weaponize your own quotes. It says that the "everything is racism" defense stops working. The second, a big chunk of the audience believes the critique is about behavior, not identity. It says that networks still think they're hosting debates, but they're actually hosting viral content factories with national consequences. And it says that Trump's greatest talent isn't persuasion in the traditional sense. It's forcing the other person to play his game in front of millions. If you want the smartest version of this narrative, you don't end with "Trump was right" or "Omar was persecuted." You end with the uncomfortable observation that Americans are exhausted, and exhaustion makes people hungry for simple verdicts. You end with the idea that a politician can spend years building a brand and lose it in one night if the brand depends on moral authority, and the opponent convinces viewers to doubt the authority. You end with the reminder that receipts are not the same as truth, but receipts are often enough to decide a cultural trial. And you end by asking the viewer, without telling them what to think, whether we've built a political culture that rewards accountability or a political culture that rewards whoever can stage the most convincing takedown. A clean debate ends with policy disagreements and a handshake. But a viral showdown ends with a list of questions hanging in the air like a bad smell nobody can open a window for. And once the questions are out there, the internet doesn't treat them like questions. It treats them like a verdict preview. That's how a single broadcast becomes a rolling story that eats weeks of coverage, because every outlet can slice it into a different moral lesson. Some people watch and see Trump doing what they wish more politicians would do, and others watch and see him practicing a kind of televised prosecution without courtroom rules. The media class, predictably, starts fighting itself before it ever gets to the underlying facts. One side says, "This is bigotry dressed up as patriotism," and the other side says, "This is accountability dressed up as comedy." But the real issue is that the format rewards whatever generates the strongest emotional reaction, not whatever best explains reality. If you're a producer, you care about the clip that spikes the graph, not the nuance that makes the graph flat. If you're a politician, you care about the moment that makes donors open their wallets, not the paragraph that makes a policy analyst nod quietly. So the next morning, the debate isn't "what should America do about immigration?" It's "what did Omar mean? What did Trump prove? And who looked guilty?" That last question is the poison, because looking guilty is not the same as being guilty, but it's often the only standard people use in the court of vibes. A binder and a confident tone can turn allegation into "everybody knows," and once everybody knows, good luck putting that toothpaste back in the tube. Even outlets trying to be careful get pulled into the gravity well, because if the story is what everyone's talking about, you either cover it or you look irrelevant. That's how caution gets punished and sensationalism gets rewarded, and it's why we keep getting the same kind of televised blood sport dressed up as civic conversation. You could feel the shift in how different audiences processed it, because they weren't processing it as one event. They were processing it as a referendum. For Trump's supporters, it wasn't just a debate. It was a symbolic reversal. The moment they felt the media's favorite moral frame got flipped on its head. For Omar's supporters, it felt like a familiar pattern. A Muslim woman put under a microscope while the loudest man in the room got treated as a folk hero. For a lot of moderates, it wasn't about either narrative. It was simpler and uglier. They saw discomfort, evasiveness, and a barrage of controversy, and they decided who won based on who looked steadier. And in modern politics, steadier often beats more correct, because steadiness feels like truth to people who don't have time to verify. Here's the part that's almost never said out loud. Politicians get trained to answer the wrong question because the incentives are backwards. They practice the inspirational line, the moral framing, the clean pivot to values. because those things win friendly interviews and energize supporters. But the hostile cross-exam is a different sport, and it's closer to litigation than to activism. If your opponent forces you to answer a narrow question and you respond with a broad moral claim, you can look like you're dodging even when you're trying to reframe. Trump lives for that split-second perception because perception is the currency he spends, and he spends it fast. That's why the most damaging moments aren't always the big lines, they're the silences. A pause that lasts too long becomes a meme, and a meme becomes a belief, and a belief becomes a narrative that no press release can fix. When Trump says, "Just show the documents," it sounds like common sense to ordinary viewers. Even though there are real reasons people don't wave personal paperwork around on national TV. When he says, "Name one time you praised America without a qualifier," it's a cheap trick, but it's also a trick that forces a person to search for an example under stress. If they can't find one quickly, the audience doesn't think, maybe the question is unfair. They think, maybe the answer doesn't exist. Now, could Omar have handled it differently? Probably, and that's not a moral judgment, it's a tactical one, because tactics are what these events reward. She could have opened with policy, not legitimacy, because telling Trump he doesn't belong is basically handing him a ladder to climb onto the story. She could have answered controversies with crisp, pre-planned sentences that acknowledge the concern without conceding the worst interpretation. And she could have refused the bait without sounding like she was hiding, which is hard. But it's the only way you survive a performer who wants to trap you in an optics box. But even that analysis has to admit something else. Trump wasn't just debating her. He was debating an audience that already had a stack of feelings about her. Omar is a lightning rod, and lightning rods don't get judged like normal politicians. They get judged like symbols. To some people, she represents American pluralism and immigrant success. And to others, she represents a kind of activist politics that feels scolding, divisive, and ungrateful. If your viewers already think she's anti-America, then every critical quote confirms it. And if your viewers already think she's unfairly targeted, then every aggressive question proves it. That's why these showdowns don't persuade as much as they polarize, because people watch to confirm their priors and leave feeling justified. The strangest thing is how quickly the facts become optional once the emotional storyline locks in. You'll see people repeating claims as if they're established, even when the most honest wording would be raised questions, triggered scrutiny, or revived allegations. You'll see the other side denying everything in one sweeping sentence, which can sound like denial rather than clarity. Meanwhile, the actual truth, what is documented, what is disputed, what has been investigated, what has been adjudicated, gets flattened into a single tribal chant. That flattening is the real damage, because it trains the public to treat politics as a series of moral executions rather than a messy system where evidence matters. There's also a deeper media problem here that nobody wants to own, because owning it would mean giving up the product. A town hall is supposed to be about voters pressing leaders, but on modern cable it's really about creating moments that can be replayed forever. Producers plan camera angles for reactions the same way sitcom directors plan laugh tracks, because reaction is the proof of impact. And when you put a person like Trump in that environment, he becomes the director as much as the guest, because he understands the medium better than many journalists. He doesn't need the moderator's permission to change the subject. He just changes it, and the moderator becomes a supporting character trying to keep up. If you're telling this story in a way that holds attention without turning into a one-sided hit piece, the key is to keep reminding people what they're actually watching. They're watching politics as entertainment, with moral stakes, edited in real time and packaged to trigger feelings. They're watching a format where the audience applause matters more than the footnote, because applause is immediate and footnotes are work. They're watching a battle between branding strategies, Omar's brand of moral critique versus Trump's brand of combative patriotism. And they're watching what happens when a moral brand gets dragged into a mud pit, because mud pits don't care how clean you were when you walked in. The day after, you get the predictable second-order effects. Colleagues hedge, allies issue carefully worded statements, and opponents act like the whole thing was inevitable. Everyone wants to be on the right side of the viral wave without being responsible for what it does to civic trust. So you see Democrats who don't love Omar's baggage quietly stepping back, and Republicans treating her as a stand-in for everything they dislike about the progressive wing. That's not new, but what's new is the speed. Because in the social era, hesitation looks like guilt, and silence looks like surrender. Even people who want to be fair get pushed into extremes because fairness is too slow for a timeline that refreshes every second. And then the machine starts mining the event for a longer storyline, because the clip alone isn't enough. You need a sequel. If there are investigations, they get framed as confirmation before they've concluded, because someone's looking into it becomes, it's real. If there aren't investigations, the absence gets framed as cover-up, because in the current mood, institutions are guilty of something no matter what they do. That's the trap of conspiratorial thinking, but it's also the trap of media cynicism, where every outcome is reinterpreted to fit the most dramatic narrative. Trump knows this and exploits it, because the point isn't to persuade the committee, it's to persuade the crowd that the committee is either corrupt or scared. So where does that leave a viewer who actually wants to think, not just feel? It leaves them with the annoying task of separating harmful optics from proven facts. And that's work the internet hates. It leaves them asking whether a politician's most controversial lines represent their worldview or represent the worst clip someone can pull from years of speech. It leaves them asking whether patriotism is being used as a sincere standard or as a club to silence dissent. And it leaves them asking whether the country can survive a media ecosystem where every disagreement gets processed like a public trial with no judge and no rules of evidence. If you want a final sting that keeps the tension tight, you don't need to claim anyone's guilty of anything. You just need to point out that the system incentivizes exactly this kind of collision, because it's profitable, it's energizing, and it's addictive. Trump thrives on it because it turns his critics into foils and his supporters into a chorus. And it lets him turn politics into a simple story about loyalty and strength. Omar suffers under it because her critics don't need to beat her on policy. They just need to make her look evasive under pressure and let the audience write the worst ending. And the rest of us are left with the uncomfortable truth that the biggest winners in these historic conversations are often the people selling the conversation itself.